and welcome back to the Prospect Podcast. I'm Ellen Halliday.
And I'm Alona Ferber.
This week, we're pleased to be joined by Canadian historian and professor at Boston University, Quinn Slobodian, to talk about his new book, Hayek's Bastards, The Neoliberal Roots of the Populist Right. Quinn, welcome back to the podcast.
Very happy to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So your book, which we have here on the desk, which is a fantastic book, is an intellectual history, very handy, of the right. And it turns one traditional explanation or common explanation for the rise of the hard populist right that we know today for figures like Trump or in the UK, Reform UK, on its head. The rise of the populist right, a hard right, is often explained as a kind of backlash against neoliberalism. We talk about communities in parts of deindustrialized Britain or America left behind by globalization, and people are choosing populist leaders to protest against that. But you argue that's not right. It's not a backlash against neoliberalism, but it's part of the same neoliberal tradition. How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, yeah, I mean, as you say, especially I think from 2016 onward, there's been this narrative of people being attracted to the far right because it gives them an outlet for frustrations about decades of wage stagnation, precariousness of employment, rising costs of living, feelings that they've been hard done by with the settlement of globalization, regional deindustrialization, things like that. And I think that's true if you look at what we call the demand side of politics. So that is why people are searching for some kind of outlet for their discontent. But if you look at what populism scholars call the supply side, i.e., who is acting as the spokespeople for this kind of resentment and rage, and how are they offering containers for people's anger, and what kind of policy programs do they offer versus what kind of policy programs do they end up delivering once in office, then the picture starts to look quite different. And if you look at the people who were part of the policy shop, so to speak, inside of the Trump administration in round one, if you look at the people who led the Leave campaign in the UK, if you look at the people who started the Alternative for Germany party, now recently declared an extreme right-wing party in Germany, these people are often actually coming out of traditions of neoliberal think tanks, libertarianism. They're actually often more concerned about what they see as overregulation of socialist entities like the European Union or the regulatory state. And they're trying to accelerate forms of competition rather than safeguard the population from the effects of the markets.
And they're not those spokespeople, they're not kind of in a backlash against neoliberalism at all. They're kind of continuing to think about it and develop it.
Yeah, well, again, it depends on how one thinks about what neoliberalism is, which is maybe a helpful place to start as well, because the term certainly gets thrown around a lot and gets used in sometimes contradictory ways. I think it's really helpful to break down a few of the main ways it gets used. Sometimes it gets used to describe a kind of period of history. So when did neoliberalism begin and when might it end? So was it the 1970s, the 1980s? Is neoliberalism over? So this becomes like a way to periodize or create an era or epoch that we're living through. Another way to use it is as a kind of policy package description. So often the Washington Consensus is invoked as this 10-point laundry list of like liberalization, privatization, deregulation, and so on. So you can then say, oh, this country is more neoliberal than that. This country has, pushed through neoliberal policies or reforms, and this one hasn't. So rather than a grand scope, it becomes like a piecemeal way to put things into different buckets. The other way it gets used is as a kind of way of understanding ourselves as a bundle of assets that can be deployed on the open market. We like ramp up our follower count, we juice our CVs, we make ourselves into entrepreneurs of ourselves. And so people sometimes talk about neoliberalism that way, like a form of subjectivity or self-understanding. But the way that I write about it in this book is to talk about it as a discrete intellectual movement. So in the 1930s was the first time that people got together and called themselves neoliberals. And by that, they meant they were different from classical liberals. They knew that the state had a new role, protecting the market, safeguarding competition, especially in a time of mass democracy and the rising interest in collectivist political movements on the right, like fascism in the 30s, and on the left, like socialism and communism. So looked at from that perspective, and that's the perspective I use, neoliberalism is an evolving conversation over the decades about how to protect capitalism against threats of democracy. So at times, these very neoliberals I write about have been enthusiastic about something like European integration, when they thought it was a way to keep nations in harness, prevent state aid from interfering with market forces, to accelerate integration. However, in the 1990s, and that's one of the places this book picks up, they started to worry that the EU had become a kind of Trojan horse for all kinds of new forms of regulation. So what they thought was the savior of the market was now turning into something that was going to, constrict and be sclerotic to market competition. So some of the, British conservatives, for example, who ended up leading the Leave campaign were on the side of Margaret Thatcher, having been enthusiastic about Europe at first, and then slowly having this creeping suspicion that this was actually a project that the socialists had sort of pulled on the conservatives behind their back. And so now you needed to get the heck out. So when I say neoliberal, I think I'm referring to these mutating and changing ideas about what kind of fixes are necessary for the ongoing challenges of stabilizing capitalism.
And what possibly a good moment to kind of unpack the title of the book.
Sure.
Hayek's Bastards, because it's sort of, there's something in that speaks to this kind of transformation and this journey in a way that neoliberals have been on. Can you explain for us a bit why that name?
Where the name comes from?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So first of all, the title is a kind of homage to this other book called Voltaire's Bastards, written by the Canadian public intellectual John Ralston Saul. That was a book that had a big influence on me as a teenager, actually. He talks about how the patrimony of the Enlightenment and the idea of reason had been used and abused across the centuries, ending with things like the industrialized slaughter of the Holocaust, the figure of someone like Robert McNamara moving from, automotives to napalm to the World Bank. So the twists and turns that something like the idea of ruling through reason can take over time under different political conditions. The person in my title, Friedrich Hayek, is a British-Austrian economist, born in 1899 in the Habsburg Empire, moved here to London in the 1930s, taught at the London School of Economics for some time, and is often seen as the most important competitor to John Maynard Keynes. So this idea of Keynes versus Hayek is a very common way to describe the challenge of big organizing economic ideas since 1945. Keynes wanted the planning state and the welfare state. Hayek wanted the free market state and wanted people to be more, self-supporting and bootstrapping without the assistance of the government. Hayek was also a very effective political entrepreneur in the sense that he was organizing like-minded intellectuals, influencing politicians. There's this famous anecdote about Thatcher banging down on the desk a copy of Hayek's Constitution of Liberty and saying, "This is what we believe." Possibly apocryphal, probably not as meaningful as it sometimes assumed to be, but nevertheless a really striking image. But Hayek himself gathered people around him who he thought was fighting the same cause, making sure social democracy didn't get out of hand, making sure communism stayed at bay. Eventually, concerns about the decolonizing world really came to the fore in the 60s and 70s. In the 1990s, as I said, both EU, but also the ecological movement, also the women's movement, also the civil rights movement. These things, especially after communism, were seen as the greatest threats to the free competition within the marketplace. So the bastards of the title then are the people who were seeing themselves as acting in the spirit of the master, so to speak, of Friedrich Hayek, but often twisting and hardening his philosophy in ways that I think were actually not paying good fidelity to the ideas of the originator.
You don't think he would have approved of his bastards?
Well, in some cases, definitely not. So one concrete example, it's worth saying that a lot of the book is about ideas of human nature. So what is the human? How are humans different? And how are populations of humans adapting over history to acquire certain traits and not others? So Hayek was interested in how what we would conventionally call like the West had developed a set of traits that were adaptive for capitalism. So they supposedly traits of, frugality and risk-taking and entrepreneurship and having a low time preference, being able to defer pleasure. A lot of things that are pretty familiar with stories about the values that underpin, the rise of the West. But he talked about this as a process of cultural evolution. He didn't think that other populations could be permanently kept out of this set of, adaptive virtues, but he thought it would be slow. Some of his bastards thought that these were not just cultural traits, but like racial and genetic, hardwired traits. So especially IQ, which becomes a big topic in the book, are things that cannot be ever acquired if your blood stock is literally coming from, primarily sourced from Africa or rather than Europe. So these extremely retrograde ideas of scientific racism, which I think many of us were surprised to see resurging in the last decade or so. I tell that intellectual story, and then surprisingly, at least to me, was when I was writing it, saw how that resurgent race science was intersecting with people who were primarily interested in economic freedom to make arguments about why this population and not that population should be allowed to immigrate to the country. This population, not that population, should be privileged inside of higher education or occupation. So that appeal to a supposedly unquestionable hard science is actually something that Hayek was always very dubious about. He called that scientism. And he thought there was a kind of a misplaced concreteness that actually socialists were more likely to use in his mind. He thought the tradition of Saint-Simon and technocracy believed that there was hard science, it was beyond question, and you could build an order on top of that. It's actually more of a fuzzy thinker than that, more of a subjectivist. And other of his, let's say, more legitimate children that I describe in the book took a different path out of his thinking. So following these schisms and trajectories is something that I was really keen on doing in the book, to show neoliberalism not as one big monolithic blob, or this idea that, we are all just commodities on the marketplace, but that actually if you pose the question of economic freedom, you're then forced to ask what kind of human operates inside the system that we are hoping to achieve. We, meaning the neoliberals, not me.
Yeah. You're not one of Hayek's bastards, just to clarify for listeners.
Not as far as I know. Nobody has made that interpretation yet.
So we'll go back a bit more to the race science stuff, because it's really fascinating and seems like such an important part of your thesis. But I want to just talk a little bit about the Mont Pellerin Society, which Hayek co-founded in 1947, which is one of his kind of initiatives that you described there. He seems definitely, this entrepreneurial, bringing people together, talking about stuff.
Yeah.
You look a lot at meetings of the society. You talk about speakers. You're looking at transcripts, discussions that happened. Why did you look at the Mont Pellerin Society specifically? What was it about that you thought could bring this alive in the book?
Well, so there's a pretty, by now, well-worn narrative about the Mont Pellerin Society. There's been these big books, one called Commanding Heights. It was even like a PBS series. And if you walk into Waterstones, you throw a dart, you'll probably hit a book that follows this trajectory of these, a lonely band of liberals in a time of social democracy who kept the flame alive, that had their big breakthrough moment with Pinochet, if it's being more critical, but really more Thatcher and Reagan. And the tracks were greased in part by think tanks like the Institute for Economic Affairs, which sort of set the tone here in London, and then the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, which all then built up an apparatus of validation and legitimation for what became like the free market breakthrough of the 1980s, and eventually morphing into the social democratic variety of Blair and Clinton and Schroeder in Germany and so on. So that's a story that by now is almost considered like canon. But what I found is that people hadn't really asked what happened after that. So what did the neoliberals themselves think about this apparent, world historical victory that they had achieved by the 1990s? Most narratives that you find out there would say, by the 90s, the history was over, neoliberalism had basically won, and there were only these rearguard actions and last readouts of socialism in Cuba and North Korea, which were basically meaningless. Even the EU was moving towards neoliberal policies. But to my surprise, and this is why I found those transcripts and those meetings minutes so interesting, they actually had the total opposite reaction to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union.
They were terrified.
They had two very different reactions, but both were forms of terror. One was that they hadn't actually won, and that this was a kind of a Pyrrhic victory. The Soviet Union had long been on the back foot. It really was not a serious competitor by the 1980s. Many historians would even say by the early 1970s, the Soviet bloc was becoming so dependent on debt and credit from banks in London and New York that it was already kind of on its knees. So they were like, Soviet Union dying, not that big of a deal. Unfortunately, the state is still big. Entitlements are still there. We still have Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security in the United States. NHS, staggered out of the Cold War, still kicking, and was then in fact boosted by Blair, of course. So there was a new hunt for the threat. And as I said, this would now generically be called like wokeism became what they saw as the new enemy that needed to be focused on. A bit more dangerous than the Soviet enemy because it was inside of the society itself. So that was part of the terror, was like, how do we fight this even more insidious enemy? And then the durability of statism, which seems so sticky that you can't, wean people off of their expectations for, let's say, Social Security once they've been offered it or promised it. But then the other side of the terror was, oh, wow, what if we actually do win, in the sense that the welfare state, as we know it, does get totally dismantled? What kind of chaos and anarchy will actually be unleashed when the basic means of survival? Yeah, no, absolutely. That's exactly this sort of a fear. And so some of the people are quite open, like Charles Murray is a main character in the book. So
he's the guy who wrote The Bell Curve.
He's the author of The Bell Curve. He was, before that, the popularizer of the notion of the underclass, which was this sort of restoration of a Victorian notion of the undeserving poor. So there was a part of the poor that were incorrigible and couldn't actually ever be reformed. So you kind of just had to warehouse them or keep them at the edge of society. Very influential also here in Britain through the IEA and the Sunday Times, actually. But Murray was very worried about this. What happens when we actually win? What happens when the opium smoking patient, as he says, using an analogy that from Herbert Spencer, is removed from their drug? Will they recover? Will they die? What parts of the population that shouldn't have been kept alive, and he was saying this kind of thing quite directly, may actually perish the day after? That's what launched a very wide-ranging debate about what the foundational basis of social organization should be. And they don't just stay in the world of philosophy and even sociology. They go to the world of sociobiology. They go to the world of evolutionary psychology. So there's at one point someone at one of these meetings conjures up the entrepreneurial spirit of bacteria and asks questions about, what the chimpanzee troop can tell us about human cooperation or fighting or conflict. And this is one of the things that I found really interesting, what, let's say, the prehistoric legacy of humans living on the savannah before language, before writing, has, bequeathed us, that we have to bear in mind when we try to rebuild from ground zero.
Yeah. So I'd be really interested to talk a bit more about kind of the through line from this moment of what sounds like somewhere between anxiety and panic at the end of the Cold War to the hard right today. You write that there was a fear at the time that the social movements of the 1960s and 70s had injected the poison of civil rights, feminism, affirmative action, and ecological consciousness into the veins of the body politic. There's some of that sort of resonates with the rhetoric you hear the hard right talking about today with regards to, policies about women's freedom, about the environment, net zero, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Do the conservative politics of today kind of have a really clear through line then from that moment of panic, or is it something different?
No, I think there is. I mean, the line even goes back earlier, in fact, like in the 1970s already. There was this very curious discourse that linked monetary issues to moral issues. So the idea was that by the United States going off the gold standard, which happened in 1971, which ends up being like a very important date for some of the people that I read about in my book, they, unleashed the printing presses, quote unquote, and were able to now just pay for all the new forms of like libertinism and immorality that the 1960s social movements had unleashed. So the idea was that that excessive expansion of the monetary supply was directly related to things like single motherhood, no-fault divorce, the idea of avoiding long-term marriages, and you needed to re-anchor actually moral order at the level of the heterosexual family unit, for example, by doing things like eliminating welfare payments for single mothers, funneling welfare payments such as they were through the breadwinning biological father of a child rather than through the mother. So all of these things were happening already in the 70s and setting the stage, I think, for this recent thing that can otherwise be quite confusing is like, why should people's individual choices have anything to do with like financial crisis? Like, it's not immediately obvious. And yet they were building up that narrative already. And the environmental one, which we've become more familiar with recently, and we know the backlash against feminism is decades old, that we might think the backlash against climate concerns is more recent. But it's very interesting that that's one of the main things already in the early 90s that they're concerned about, that the menace has turned from red to green is a way that it was frequently described. So it tells us something first about actually the way that environmental activism has come and gone in waves. So there was a kind of a high tide of talking about global warming in the late 80s that has subsided for some time and then resurged more recently. But it also tells us something about how they see a set of seemingly disconnected policies as both interconnected and also as potentially Trojan horses for what they see as the rollout of some grand socialist plan, which is, we've seen some of the further fringes of that, I feel like, recently with the opposition to the 15-minute city, for example, or the opposition to COVID containment measures.
I mean, those things are very connected. And
Yep.
lots of people would say that, that the pandemic was a moment that sort of provoked these conversations. Do you think that's right? Was a trigger needed? Or was that thinking heading in that direction already?
I think it definitely, conscripted new populations into that kind of thinking who maybe otherwise would not have been drawn to it. So I wrote about this a bit at the time in 2021. My colleague Will Callison and I wrote about what we call diagonalism. So how traditionally right-wing politics were suddenly bringing in people who had been previously coded as left. So people like that, not to put too fine a point on, but hippies and kind of new age folks and like the so-called radicalized yoga instructor were now joining ranks with like hardcore libertarians and small business owners.
The kind of wellness zone.
Exactly. That RFK Jr. is now such a good representative of. So the larger story and the one I try to offer in the book is that in these moments of uncertainty, even quantitative easing in the sense of the loss of the importance of value as people's savings corrode under low interest rates, lead people to desire what the financial press would call a flight to safety. So, you try to find something that will provide an anchor for you in a time of disruption. And if you're an investor, usually that would mean like American bonds or gold. And quite literally, the last chapter is about the people who think that the devoted market capitalist radicals who think that that capitalism has grown so ungoverned that you actually need to return it to a firmer basis. So you need to get away from paper currency and, hoard gold bars and gold coins, because what they call monetary socialism has unleashed this wave of liquidity that will eventually crash. So you need to prepare yourself in advance. And meanwhile, often they would say, and I can sell it to you for a commission if you're interested. So this kind of entrepreneurial catastrophe thinking is something that I try to draw out in the book that I do think is ever more part of the politics that we're seeing in the United States, for sure, where it's even less now about some grand vision that Hayek would have cultivated of the need to create, global communities such that there is an international division of labor and the world's resources can most efficiently be drawn on. Now it's really more like the pump and dump model of like, find the next schmuck, sell them a line about monetary collapse, and then, give them the opportunity to be in on the scheme before it collapses. And I feel like the acceleration of the libertarian movement, the bastardization in many ways of the original defense of some evolutionary system is one of the directions that my book sort of points towards.
So one of the sort of great mysteries of U.S. politics today is whether Donald Trump believes anything, right? Like, has he got does he have any ideology, or is he just
Andrew Lloyd Webber?
He believes Andrew Lloyd Webber. He loves musicals.
He really does.
But does he have just people around him with these beliefs, or does he where does he sit in your understanding of this intellectual landscape? Is he kind of just is he benefiting from this because he's an opportunist, or does he believe in any of it?
Yeah, first of all, it's impossible to imagine him banging Hayek on the Resolute desk in the Oval Office the way that Margaret Thatcher did. A CD of Evita, yes, absolutely. No, but I don't see him as an intellectual creature or entity, right? He's not someone who's driven by ideas. He's someone who has been very effective at diagnosing the ways that the existing structures can be played in game to benefit him, and regardless of how poorly he mismanages his own resources. So I've written in the past about how well he used corporate bankruptcy law. So how he was able to have serial failures and yet always land back on his feet. So I think he's a perverse product in a way of the American legal system that has been set up to, smooth the path for those with money and punish those without. I mean, there's this Matthew effect there that gives more to those who already have and then takes more from those who don't. And as a politician, he's an entertainer, and he is this cynosure, if that's the way to pronounce it, of all eyes whenever he enters a room. And canny political actors around him have been able to take advantage of that. So I see him, and have seen him for the last 8 years, as a kind of a locomotive, smashing up existing conventions and institutions with a bunch of people, grabbing on to the locomotive with their own sets of policy ideas. And then some of them make it through, some of them slip off halfway. And the way that certain policies around trade get rolled out, while other ones on, tax reform get rolled out, and others on deregulation of energy extraction get rolled out, suggests less an overall coherent plan than just the kind of, collage of many diverse political programs getting realized piecemeal. And so the Elon Musk example, I think, is perfect to point to there, because you can see him as Musk is someone who is not himself Trumpist, but sees why Maga can get him to some goals and can, maybe by his own presence there, prevent other more disruptive things from being rolled out. And the first 100 days is already this incredible laboratory of half-realized measures, unexpected consequences, counterproductive victories that defies, I think, the skills of any intellectual historian, right? I mean, then it becomes a matter of the day-to-day reporting that people do in magazines like yours.
Well, one of the things that's really, of course, you talk about in the book that's so interesting is kind of at some point in the 90s, Pat Buchanan becomes a potential kind of political figure who will lead this movement if he wins. But there's an understanding among this group of people that if they, and this goes back to the kind of the misunderstanding of this backlash to neoliberalism that your book is about, that if you get kind of the masses versus the elite, this is the way to get these ideas sort of in a political position. And Trump is so, whoever around him has kind of managed to get him to be the person who makes that a reality.
Yes.
But that's not his, you don't think that's his sort of, it's not that he came to this understanding. He was just in the right place at the right time.
I think that's right. So I think, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I do think it's one of the important moments of bastardization in the book as well. And it's one of the bigger inversions in neoliberal strategy you could see from the 1930s to the present. When Hayek was first proposing these ideas in the 30s and 40s, he assumed that the masses tended socialist, that they, if given their will, would, seize the state and use it to, redistribute its wealth out to their friends and colleagues and comrades. And so the role of states and laws was to prevent the masses from doing that. So you can do certain things that are counter-majoritarian. You can do certain things that are forms of pre-commitment that tie the hands of governments. think of things like balanced budget amendments or budget rules at the European Central Bank. Those were all very much in the spirit of Hayek, which is like suspicious of the masses. You convince the elites that the masses are a concern and that it's in everyone's best interest to do things that will keep like free market order, on track. By the 1990s, Murray Rothbard, another big character in the book, who, was part of this Mont Pellerin society since the 1950s, but quite a bit more out there. He's an anarcho-capitalist. He believes that you can do away with the state, which not many neoliberals did. I mean, certainly Milton Friedman didn't. James Buchanan, Hayek never thought that. They always thought the state was useful and necessary. But Rothbard says by the 90s, hey, let's look at the masses again. I mean, are these a bunch of socialists in waiting? Not at all. And we don't have trade unions effectively anymore. We don't have powerful socialist or communist parties, certainly in the United States. People are actually bought into the very principles of like individualism and social Darwinist competition that we always thought we needed to kind of train them into. So where are the socialists? Well, they're in the elite class. The only socialists left are the people at Harvard, the people at the, Federal Trade Commission, the people in Brussels. So we can actually use and should use the masses against the elites to break up the remaining existence of, progressive socialism, such as it remains, which is a common narrative about the so-called professional managerial class, which is not actually the employee class. It's not actually people who are making anything. They're just tone policing and checking to make sure everyone's acting in the right way, and they need to be destroyed. So he thought that maybe Buchanan could be that person in the early 1990s. Buchanan's policies were not very neoliberal or libertarian. He was a protectionist. He's a nativist. He was a traditionalist in all of these ways that wouldn't really put economic freedom at the top of the list. And then more recently, people have seen Trump as that kind of a figure too. And there's a self-conscious willingness to make alliances with someone who might not line up with all your policies because pragmatically speaking, they're going to get you somewhere that you wouldn't have got to otherwise. And that's the same story you get with the Alternative for Germany party, for example. A bunch of like button-down ordo-liberal economics professors who look at the more wild-eyed far-right ethno-nationalists and say like, hey, why not? We're not going to get anywhere without the engine of like Islamophobia and anti-immigrant hatred. So let's work together. And people look at it and say, what is this? Like, I don't get it. Is it incoherent? Does it make sense? Well, it's a tactical alliance that makes sense, a lot of sense, and it's been very successful in context. So that's something I think that I'm also trying to illuminate.
I mean, the other interesting figure in that German context is Sarah Wagenknecht, who started out in the left party and kind of pulled away from that to set up her own party that's leftist but allied with the AfD. So and lots of people really struggle to make sense of that.
Yes.
But I think the point that you make about kind of alliances, the importance that some of these figures place on kind of instrumentalizing is really interesting.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about what it is that is shared and agreed upon within this group that you call the New Fusionists?
Yeah.
And where maybe the points of difference are? And I think as part of that, I think it's very interesting when it's an interesting conversation about the left and the right. People often say that maybe the left are not as good at, getting past their differences to make something happen. Is that something that you've also found to be borne out in your study of the evolution of kind of these ideas?
Yeah, so that idea of the new fusionism is something we haven't actually discussed yet, but the idea there is that the American conservative right had been long called fusionist, by which was meant a joining of people who believe primarily in markets and economic freedom with people who are mostly motivated by ideas of religious tradition and morality. The new fusionism is an idea that actually someone, who's part of this movement in the late 1980s coins. He says it noticed that recently people who were making arguments on the right were often doing it less in a language of religion and more in a language of science. So suddenly there was a new authority given to genomics and cognitive psychology and sociobiology that there hadn't been before. And Charles Murray is a great example of that, right? So the bell curve that you mentioned already in 1994 is an attempt to say, listen, we can never have equal outcomes in this country. educational reform will never actually make things the same for the Black population and the white population. These things are hardwired. We need to begin, as they call it, living with inequality. And if you don't trust us, then here are, 14 appendices filled with tables of data that are supposedly irrefutable because the Harvard psychologists who co-wrote the book have been responsible for producing them. So that was a different way of making the case, actually. And it lines up very well with Thilo Sarrazin in the German case, who wrote this book, Germany's Doing Itself In, or Germany is Abolishing Itself, that very similarly, said, we need to cut down on immigration, not because we need to save the West or something abstract like that, but because supposedly, low IQs dominate in Muslim majority countries with a bunch of bad science supporting this like false conclusion in the footnotes, thus opening the possibility for, I think, more middle class and middle brow people to say like, okay, maybe this isn't just, some cuckoo hatred stuff, but actually might have some basis in science we need to look at more seriously. So that suggests two things to me. One, it suggests that the left should not leave the terrain of science to the right and think that science and politics exist in different spheres. I think it has been long the case that we assume that social construction of all forms of human nature is the way to understand things, and that, nothing is hardwired and, everything is malleable, and we just need to imagine things differently. And that's the tradition I was raised in anyway, in the 90s and early 2000s. And there is a way that has been an abandonment of the field of science. And that's not necessary. And there's lots of really interesting arguments one can make with science that don't just involve saying it's just reproducing hegemony and we shouldn't take any of it seriously.
But then in a field, just to interrupt you there a second, in a field where there is a lot of science, climate science, the right just says, we don't believe this, and it's kind of completely invented and you can't rely on it, right? Where the left does rely on the science.
Right, that is true. But then most of the time, rather than just saying we don't believe it, they deploy their own science, right? I mean,
it's not like a science versus science.
It's a science versus science, yeah. And that was, I think, also true in the period of COVID, right? Like, it was a great experiment, actually, in public science where the people were openly saying, this is a provisional conclusion, we don't know yet, this is the best projection we have, this is constantly being updated. And there was actually like a positive way of seeing, I think, that experience of 2020. It's a time when it was often joked, like, everyone became an epidemiologist overnight. Well, maybe that's kind of great, actually, if everyone was like, hey, I can figure out this out at some basic level and have my strong opinion about it. Maybe we could have more of that. But then to the second point about the left and whether or not it should take some tips about strange bedfellows and the willingness to set aside differences, I completely agree with that. And there are examples of that. So, I mean, the last French election was a perfect example of the new Popular Front setting aside very, very serious, long-standing, even like hatreds between the Socialist Party and the Communist Party and other wings of the left to say, listen, the threat is bigger than our differences are. So let's make an alliance and figure out a new way of thinking about, at least provisionally, how alliances and cooperations can work. I think there's something very instructive and important about that, the urgency with which the people in my book confronted what they saw as their own existential threat.
And when you look at so we talked about Trump, people around him maybe sort of using his destructive power to pursue policies here, policies there, and they have different interests.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about are there factions then in this kind of broad sweep of people who've emerged out of this bastardization of kind of the neoliberal ideas?
Yeah.
People often talk about maybe J.D. Vance and Steve Bannon don't exactly agree on everything. Maybe you have different intellectual origins.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about how those play out? Who sits where, who's together, and who are competing?
Yeah. I think in the first Trump administration, there were more people that more cleanly fit in the template I'm setting out here. So, for example, Arthur Laffer, who had been instrumental in advising Reagan in his first administration, proposing the idea of the Laffer curve, which was like the more you tax people, the less they're going to work. So you actually need to lower taxes to increase productivity and growth. Supply side economics was born out of this idea of Arthur Laffer. He was also instrumental in writing the 2017 Tax Cut Act that was really Trump's only major legislative accomplishment. So here was someone who was willing to set aside or, be willing to work with Trump despite the fact that he was saying a lot of very unlibertarian, un-neoliberal things about protectionism and the new power of the state and bringing back industry and so on. So that was a pretty clear example, I think, of someone willing to work in that way. Stephen Moore, who was also an advisor of Trump in the first administration and through the early period of COVID, was similarly aligned that way. Mm-hmm. This time around, as many people have noted, I mean, the dial has been turned a bit further towards the outlandish, and the intellectual genealogies become a bit more confusing. I think that the fact that Heritage Foundation, which is part of this first crop of influential neoliberal think tanks, built to, as they called it, wage the war of ideas, as Ed Follner, the original founder of the Heritage Foundation, put it, has now written the Project 2025 document, which many people see as the spec set of instructions, really, for the Trump administration, rightly so, is a pretty good place to look. I think you can find in there traces of this willingness to break with free trade orthodoxy, break with even the dominance of corporations in making business decisions. There's a language of even like antitrust and protectionism that is a real evolution, let's say, pivot, change from what Heritage would have been saying 20 or 30 years ago. And yet, I think they see the expedience in meeting halfway people like J.D. Vance, Josh Hawley, Oren Cass, people who think that that shareholder model capitalism had, run roughshod over a lot of people's lives. So the question is, who will win in that confrontation? And I tend to think, or what I'm observing so far in the first 100 days, is rhetoric aside, the actual material improvement of the lives of everyday people in the United States, especially working class and poor people, has not improved and shows no sign of improving. In fact, life's getting harder for people at the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid in the United States. Why? Because this supposed effort to reindustrialize America has been using only the stick of tariffs without the carrot of industrial policy and subsidies for investment that would be necessary, which is what Biden was doing in 2020, using the state to create new sectors of employment with, daycare, with the possibility for unionization, while pursuing a just energy transition. The current economic policy of the Trump administration is mostly just theatrics and, bullying other countries on the world stage with no real attention to knitting back together the kind of, care infrastructure which would be necessary for people to see everyday improvements in their lives. Instead, he's just saying, you can only get 2 dolls this Christmas and not 30, which is a kind of like a caricature of like Victorian heartlessness in the face of people's sense of uncertainty.
Yeah. One of the figures you end your book with is Javier Milei, the Argentinian president, who kind of seems to embody so perfectly everything that you write about in the book. He almost seems like he's been cut out of the internet and like put to head, at the head of a government.
Yeah. That's correct.
So is he actually like, is he, there's been some controversies around cryptocurrency with him, for example, cryptocurrency potential scam.
Yes.
There's a sort of like a case against him now.
Yep.
Is he genuinely kind of motivated by ideology and intellectual president, really believing in this stuff? Or is it about interest? Is that what's really happening? Or is it a meld of both?
I think he is much more, identifiable as an intellectually committed person. No comparison to Trump in that sense. I mean, he's a trained economist. He sees himself as a student effectively of Murray Rothbard, the anarcho-capitalist I just mentioned. He has described himself as an anarcho-capitalist on many occasions, while conceding that it's difficult to be the head of state when you don't believe in states whatsoever. So he would concede that he governs as what they call a minarchist. So someone who believes that the state should be as small as possible. And the people who he cites as his advisors are directly out of the stable of literally like Mont Pellerin Society members. So an Argentine economist named Alberto Benegas Lynch, Alberto Benegas Lynch's son, also involved with the government. When he met Vivek Ramaswamy, they exchanged greetings and said, you're more of a Hayek guy, I'm more of a Mises guy. And Milei said, no, but I'm really a Rothbard guy. So there's no leaps of interpretation necessary for me in those cases. But what he's doing, though, is, I think, then another question. I wrote a piece after he was just elected called Monster of the Mainstream for the New Statesman. And I still kind of believe that if, he's praised by the financial press. Actually, there was just Ruchir Sharma just wrote an op-ed last week in the Financial Times saying like Milei is leading the way to create a new, pushback against the new pink tide in Latin America. He's bringing rationality and frugality back to the practice of government. How is he doing that? By, slashing cultural budgets, by destroying the right of people to protest and organize, by rolling back the benefits that had been won over the last years, and restoring creditworthiness on the part of the Argentine investors and bond markets, and certainly benefiting by the fact that he has a close, friendly relationship with the United States, so that when the latest IMF package went through, many of the governors were very skeptical, but the Americans on the board who dominate basically said, like, no, gave it a pass. But I don't think actually I think he's more of a true believer than someone who's just in on the grift. I mean, by all accounts, he was kind of duped by the crypto thing. He likes his fans, and someone said, "Hey, President, like, say this about this thing. It's about you." And he said, "Okay." And then when his advisors, or more precisely,
what has he done?
Said like, "No," then he quickly deleted it. But then it was too late. So as opposed to Trump, and his children, who are designing a whole meme coin token ecosystem around the president, which has now been designed in such a way that you can buy access to the president directly by having the largest amount of Trump tokens in your digital anonymous wallet.
Oh my God.
They'll have face-to-face meetings at Mar-a-Lago later this month. Or even more dramatically, his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff's son, Zach Witkoff, now also rolling out a crypto scheme with an Abu Dhabi-based crypto exchange. Yeah, so that level of insider dealing and blatant naked enrichment schemes, which would have long been beyond the pale, but now seem to be just the way politics is done. Ironically, I think Milei might be one of the more honorable among them in the sense that his bastardhood is like perhaps like less pronounced than some of the other people in certain ways.
I mean, you're based in America.
Yeah,
you're Canadian.
Yes,
sitting here in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
In these three countries, there's a lot to be worried about politically.
Mm-hmm.
And you've talked about the conditions of working class Americans is probably going to be getting worse.
Yeah.
People in power who are taking decisions potentially for their own benefit. It's not a happy picture at the moment.
It isn't, no.
Through your work,
Yeah.
Is there anything that makes you kind of optimistic or hopeful at the moment about the future?
Yeah, I mean, the Canadian example is actually pretty apropos, right? I mean, there was going to be a mini Maga prime minister up until a couple of months ago, and now we have someone who has his normal sort of 90s neoliberal style flaws, right? Like Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, governor of the Bank of Canada, big proponent of what he called green central banking. That's certainly many on the left have their criticisms of, but at least it's the kind of criticisms that one can work with, right? Like, it's like, all right, what's the balance here between creating an energy transition and, keeping the same asset managers, fat and happy as they always have been? I can accept and live with that level of dysfunction It may not be optimal for, human survival in the long run. But the radical disruptive quality of the Trump second administration, I think, has shocked the world to such an extent that it's having an accelerating effect on the pendulum swinging away from, I think, these kind of right-wing policies and towards some kind of more rebooted global community minus USA. The Australian election obviously played out in the same way, and center-left party returned to power, and nobody thought that was going to happen until recently. So as with Musk's intervention in elections in Germany and elsewhere, it's not clear actually that they can just, play puppet master in any part of the world that they choose. Actually, it's starting to look like they have the reverse Midas touch, where anyone they to get involved with ends up losing the next election, or not doing any better than they would have otherwise. So I think, is the moment you step outside of the U.S., you start to actually see a lot more signs of optimism, because indeed the BRICS countries, China to a certain extent, is willing to take on that role of leadership and coordination of multiple, different economies with different motivations in a way that the U.S. has now completely abnegated. So I think looked at positively, this new polycentric kind of form of world order could perhaps, we weren't getting anywhere before, so maybe this new one might, stagger its way towards some unlikely, but
the bar is very low.
The bar is low, and we're just happy with moderate levels of dysfunction at this point. That's all we're shooting for.
On that note, thank you so much for joining us on the Prospect Podcast.
Good to be here.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect Podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.